February 1945, the frostbitten air over the Western Front carried more than the smell of cordite and exhaustion. It carried the drone of engines steady, relentless, impossibly close. In a makeshift prisoner of war compound near the Belgian border, German women pressed their faces against the wire fence, their breath forming small clouds in the winter air. These were not combat soldiers, but auxiliary personnel, telegraphists, nurses, anti-aircraft spotters captured during the Allied advance through the Rhineland. Their gray uniforms hung loose on frames that had known too many months of rationed black bread and ersatz coffee. Their eyes, hollow from sleepless nights in overcrowded barracks, turned skyward as the sound grew louder. What they saw that morning would fracture something fundamental in the narrative they had been taught since childhood. A C-47 transport plane descended through the morning haze, its silhouette unmistakable against the pale sky. Artillery fire crackled in the distance. The front line was less than 15 kilometers away. The plane banked sharply, avoiding a pocket of flak that erupted like dark flowers in the air. Then it dropped lower, wheels extending, approach steady, despite the chaos. The women watched in silence as the aircraft touched down on a hastily cleared strip of frozen mud, its propellers still spinning as ground crews rushed forward. And then the cockpit door opened. A figure emerged, pulling off a leather flight helmet, and shoulder-length hair tumbled free. The pilot was a woman. Not just any woman, but an American woman, who climbed down from that machine with the casual confidence of someone performing a routine task, not a death-defying act. Behind her, another plane approached. Then another. The sky seemed full of them now, transport planes piloted by women. Landing under fire as if it were the most natural thing in the world, the German prisoners stood frozen, their minds struggling to reconcile what their eyes reported. This was not possible. This could not be real. In the Reich, women were kinder, Kuch, Kirche children, kitchen, church. The Führer himself had declared that the German woman's world was her husband, her family, her children, and her home. The very concept of a woman at the controls of a military aircraft, flying into a combat zone, delivering supplies to the front lines, represented a reality so foreign it might as well have descended from another planet. Yet here they were, dozens of them, members of the Women Air Force Service pilots, the WASPs performing the same duties as their male counterparts, ferrying everything from fighters to bombers across continents and oceans, towing targets for gunnery practice, testing repaired aircraft, and now delivering critical supplies to forward positions in the final months of the European war. To understand the magnitude of what these German women witnessed that February morning, one must first understand what they had been promised. The National Socialist ideology that shaped their worldview was built upon a rigid hierarchy of gender, race, and national destiny. From the earliest days of the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, young women in Germany were instructed that their primary contribution to the fatherland was biological. The 1934 Nuremberg Rally had proclaimed women as the guardians of racial purity, their bodies the vessels through which the thousand-year Reich would populate its conquered territories. Gertrude Scholz-Klink, the Reich women's leader, traveled the country giving speeches about the nobility of motherhood, the sanctity of the household, and the divine order that placed men in the realm of politics and war while women remained in the domestic sphere. This was not merely propaganda, it was woven into every aspect of German life, from school curricula to marriage loans that were forgiven with each child born, from the honor cross of the German mother awarded to women who bore 4 or more children to the systematic removal of women from professional positions in universities, government, and industry. The women who now stood behind that wire fence had grown up in this system. They had been told that American women were frivolous creatures, obsessed with cosmetics and Hollywood fantasies, morally corrupted by jazz music and racial mixing, living in a chaotic democracy that had stripped them of their natural feminine dignity. The propaganda films they had seen depicted American women as either helpless housewives utterly dependent on their men or as masculine, aggressive caricatures who had abandoned their God-given roles. The notion that such women could possess the technical skill, The physical courage and the mental fortitude to pilot complex aircraft through combat conditions was beyond the framework of acceptable reality. And yet, the evidence was landing before them. Again and again, each touchdown another hammer blow against the ideological foundation they had trusted. What these German prisoners could not have known was that the women they watched had fought their own battles long before reaching European airspace. The Women Air Force Service Pilots program was born from desperate necessity in 1942, when the United States faced a critical shortage of male pilots as combat demands soared. Jacqueline Cochran, an accomplished aviator who had set numerous speed records before the war, proposed using experienced female pilots to handle domestic ferrying duties, thereby freeing male pilots for combat assignments. The idea faced fierce resistance. Military commanders questioned whether women possessed the physical strength to handle large aircraft, the emotional stability to remain calm in emergencies, and the technical aptitude to master complex navigation and flight systems. Congressmen declared that sending women into such dangerous work was unnatural and immoral. Editorial pages warned that women pilots would become coarse and masculine, unfit for marriage and motherhood after the war, yet by the time those German women watched in disbelief, more than 1,000 American women had graduated from the WASP-aiding program at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. They had learned to fly everything from light trainers to B-17, flying fortresses and B-29 superfortresses, the same heavy bombers that were reducing German cities to rubble. They had mastered instrument flying, night navigation, and emergency procedures. They had ferried aircraft from factories to embarkation points, towed targets while male gunners fired live ammunition sometimes, two close and tested planes fresh from repair to ensure they were safe for combat pilots. They had done all this without military rank, without military benefits, and without the honor accorded to their male counterparts. When a WASP died in service and 38 of them did, her body was sent home at her family's expense, with no flag, no military funeral, no recognition of her sacrifice. They flew anyway. They flew because the country needed them, because the work mattered. And because they could, the German women at the fence watched as another C-47 landed, this one carrying medical supplies urgently needed at forward aid stations. The pilot who emerged was young, perhaps 25, with a confident stride that spoke of hundreds of hours in the air. She conferred briefly with ground personnel, signed paperwork on a clipboard, then climbed back into the cockpit as the plane was refueled and loaded with wounded soldiers for the return flight. The entire operation took less than 20 minutes. The efficiency was startling, but more startling still was the casual normalcy of it all. The male ground crew treated her as a peer, not a curiosity. There was no deference, no special accommodation, no sense that anything unusual was occurring. This was simply work, and she was simply doing it. One of the German prisoners, a former Luftwaffe auxiliary named Greta Hoffmann, would later recall in a 1952 interview with American military historians that she felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. Hoffmann had served at an anti-aircraft installation in Hamburg, tracking Allied bombers through the night sky, calling out coordinates that directed the flak batteries. She had believed herself to be contributing meaningfully to the war effort, proof that German women could serve beyond the kitchen. But her role, she now realized, had been carefully circumscribed. She had not trained on the guns themselves, that was men's work. She had not made strategic decisions that required a masculine mind. She had occupied a support function, important but subordinate, always under male authority. The American women she now observed operated their machines alone, made life-and-death decisions in the air without consultation, carried the full weight of responsibility that came with commanding complex military equipment. "We thought we were modern," Hoffmann said. "We thought the Reich had elevated us beyond the limited role women played in the old Germany. But watching those pilots, I understood that what we called elevation was still a cage. It was a larger cage than before, perhaps, but still a cage. They were free. The symbolism of flight itself cannot be overstated. Throughout human history, the ability to fly has represented the ultimate expression of freedom. The transcendence of earthly limitations, the conquest of nature through human ingenuity, that such capability should belong to women and not just belong, but be wielded with casual mastery represented a fundamental rejection of the biological essentialism that undergirded Nazi ideology. If women could fly combat-capable aircraft, then what other supposed limitations were merely social constructs rather than natural law? If American women could be trusted with machines that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and required years of training to master, what did that say about the German system that deemed women incapable of managing their own finances without male approval? The questions multiplied with each landing, each takeoff, each glimpse of a female face beneath a flight helmet. The historical record shows that the German prisoners were not alone in their astonishment. American male pilots, too, had initially resisted the WES program with arguments that sound absurdly quaint in retrospect but were deadly serious at the time. In 1943, male ferry pilots complained that women were taking jobs that rightfully belonged to men, that the presence of women in military aviation was a publicity stunt that would get people killed, that the stress of combat conditions would cause women to panic or freeze. The evidence proved otherwise. WASP pilots compiled a safety record equal to or better than their male counterparts. They flew the same long, exhausting routes, dealt with the same mechanical failures, navigated through the same dangerous weather. Nancy Love, who directed the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron before it merged into the WASP program, personally delivered more than 100 aircraft, including high-performance fighters and heavy bombers, and Baumgartner became the first American woman to pilot a jet aircraft when she flew the YP-59A in 1944. These were not symbolic gestures or propaganda exercises, they were operational necessities. That proved American women could do what Nazi ideology declared impossible. What the German prisoners witnessed that morning was not merely a difference in policy, but a difference in fundamental worldview. The United States had not created the WASP program out of progressive ideology. American society in 1945 was deeply segregated. Women faced systematic discrimination in employment and education, and the notion of true gender equality remained decades away. The program existed because American pragmatism had temporarily overridden American prejudice. The country needed pilots, women could be trained to fly, therefore women would fly. It was a utilitarian calculation, not a moral crusade. But to the German women watching from behind the wire, the distinction was irrelevant. What mattered was the result, a society capable of adapting, of temporarily setting aside its own biases when circumstances demanded, of recognizing competence regardless of its source. This flexibility, this willingness to embrace solutions that contradicted traditional norms, represented a kind of strength that the rigid Nazi system could not match. The irony was sharp and bitter. Germany had mobilized women extensively during the war, far more than the Allied propaganda suggested. German women worked in munitions factories, served as auxiliaries in the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, staffed the anti-aircraft batteries that defended the cities, and even flew as test pilots in rare cases. Hannah Reich, Germany's most famous female aviator, had tested rocket planes and jet aircraft, demonstrating that German women were as capable as any when given the opportunity. But these exceptions remained just that, exceptions. Individual women granted special privileges due to extraordinary talent, always presented as anomalies rather than evidence of broader capability. The system could tolerate exceptional women as curiosities, but it could not integrate them as equals without undermining the ideological foundation that justified everything else. American women pilots, by contrast, were trained in groups, deployed in squadrons, treated as a category rather than as individuals. The difference was structural, not personal. As the day progressed, more aircraft arrived. The German prisoners learned that the American advance had outpaced supply lines, and every available plane was being pressed into service to deliver fuel, ammunition, and food to forward units. The WASP pilots were flying multiple missions, landing, refueling, loading, and taking off again with minimal rest. The prisoners watched as one pilot, barely out of the cockpit, devoured a sandwich while maintenance crews checked her plane, then climbed back in for another run. The casual heroism of it was overwhelming. These women were not performing for an audience or proving a point. They were simply doing what needed to be done, accepting danger as an occupational hazard, focused entirely on the mission. The mundanity of their courage made it somehow more profound. For many of the German prisoners, the experience triggered a kind of cognitive dissonance that would take years to process. They had been raised in a system that promised them purpose and dignity through racial superiority and traditional gender roles. They had been told that the chaos and decadence of democratic societies produced weak, confused women who had lost touch with their natural function. They had been assured that Germany's rigid order, its clear hierarchies and defined roles, represented the only path to national greatness and female fulfillment. The evidence now landing repeatedly before them suggested that every premise was false. American women were not weak. They were piloting military aircraft through flak and bad weather. They were not confused. They executed complex missions with precision and confidence. They had not lost their femininity. They simply defined it differently, as compatible with competence rather than contradictory to it. The supplies being delivered told their own story. When ground crews unloaded one of the C-47s, the German women saw crates of food that made their months of turnip soup and sawdust bread seem like a cruel joke. There were canned fruits, tinned meats, chocolate bars, cigarettes, luxury items that had vanished from German stores years ago, now flowing in such abundance that they could be sent to frontline troops as routine provisions. One crate split open, and packets of coffee spilled out real coffee. Not the chicory substitute that had become the norm in the Reich. The smell was intoxicating. A sensory memory of a world before rationing and sacrifice. This abundance, delivered by women flying machines, represented American industrial capacity made tangible. It was not just that America could produce so much, it was that American women were trusted to deliver it, were trained to operate the systems that distributed it, were integrated into the logistical network that sustained armies across continents. Some of the prisoners wept. Others simply stared in silence. A few turned away, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they had believed. One woman, a nurse who had served in field hospitals on the Eastern Front, approached an American guard and asked in hesitant English whether the pilots were volunteers or conscripts. When told they were volunteers, women who had chosen to fly, who had competed for positions in the program, who had paid their own way to training in some cases, she shook her head slowly. "We were told you forced women to work," she said quietly. "We were told American women were slaves to capitalism, that democracy meant chaos and suffering for the weak." The guard, a young corporal from Ohio, shrugged. "Ma'am, I don't know much about democracy," he said. "But those ladies up there? They're here because they want to be. Nobody forced them into those cockpits. They fought for the right to be there."